Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to look at a paper that was published by a former Russian politician, Vladimir Milov, who was formerly the Deputy Minister for Energy. And he's been looking at the state of the Russian economy and assessing the impact of the current switch to being a wartime economy and also the fall in the value of the ruble on the long-term health of Russia. And he's identified the fact that Russian reserves are now running low. So in today's episode, we'll go through the details of this paper, we'll have a look at what's going on with regards to GDP, and we'll look at the analysis that's provided, talking about which areas are currently growing the most and which areas are being neglected, and talk about the long-term implications of that. We'll also have a look at the movement in the value of the ruble and what the impact of that has been on both exports and imports for Russia and what the long-term implications of that will be. We'll talk about what's happening with the reserves and why Vladimir Milov is concerned that Russia is running out of freely available reserves, so basically cash and gold. We'll talk about what's going on with investment in the economy and wages. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the findings of this paper are and what the implications of this are for the Russian economy. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. Really mean this. If you're a long-term supporter, if you've signed up either through Patreon, where you can get early access to my videos and also watch them advert-free, or YouTube membership, where you can also get early access, or buy me a coffee membership, thank you so much for that. It really means a lot to me that you've taken the time and effort to sign up and you're supplying me with regular support. It really helps to keep me motivated, keeps me focused, keeps me thinking up more topics to post on a regular basis. And if you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks recently, thank you so much for the time and effort you've taken to do that. Really means a lot to me, helps to keep me going, so thanks. Vladimir Milov is an economist and a former Russian politician who held the post of Deputy Minister of Energy of the Russian Federation in 2002. He is the author of numerous analytical materials, concept papers and publications on energy policy and infrastructure development in Russia, and collaborated on state programs for reforming the country's gas industry, electric power industry and railway transport, and proposed a reform project for Gazprom, which was subsequently rejected by Vladimir Putin. In 2008, he co-founded an opposition movement in Russia, and in 2016 began actively participating in Alexei Navalny's presidential campaign. Milov is now living in exile in Lithuania and is an outspoken critic of President Putin and the war in Ukraine. Milov recently published a paper through the Wilfried Martens Center think tank called The Russian Economy Still Standing But Stuck. This paper is a follow-up to a previous paper that was published in June 23, entitled From Bad to Worse, The Continuing Effects of Sanctions on Russia, and the objective is to analyse the nuanced effects of Western sanctions against Russia 2 years after the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. The paper is designed to provide Western policymakers with realistic, in-depth analysis of the multiple effects of sanctions on the Russian economy. The first question that this paper raises is whether or not GDP is actually a good reflection of the strength of an economy. Now, I think this is a really interesting topic because I talk about GDP a lot when we're talking about all the economies in the world. And this generically is used as a measure that tells us whether or not an economy is strong or whether it's weak. We look at the GDP, we compare it to other countries, we look at the GDP compared to this time last year and the year before, and if GDP is increasing, then we assume that the economy is doing better. If GDP is going down, then it must be getting worse. But in this paper, Milov actually addresses the question as to what's driving the movement in GDP. And obviously in Russia at the moment, the change towards being a war economy, focusing in on industries that can help the effort in Ukraine, is actually driving up an increase in GDP. But the question is that healthy for the long-term future of the Russian economy? This chart shows us the key components of Russia's GDP growth in 2023. And as you can see at the bottom here, total GDP growth was 3.6%, which was a strong result and was actually higher than the GDP growth in the USA. However, the uplift in GDP in 2023 was driven by four main areas of the economy: electronics and optical products, computers, radar devices, and radio electronics increased by almost 33% as a result of the fact that many of these industries and products were useful to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and so a lot of money was invested directly from the Kremlin into producing a lot of this equipment. The second largest growth area was finished metal products other than machinery and equipment, including the production of weapons and ammunition, which increased by almost 28%. And once again, the majority of the products being produced in this field were used in Ukraine, and so that was also funded by the Kremlin. The third largest growth area was other transport facilities and equipment, including military aircraft, tanks, and armoured vehicles, which grew by almost 26%. And once again, the majority of that growth related directly to equipment that was used in Ukraine. And interestingly, one of the other areas of the economy that grew strongly in 23 was construction, which hit growth of 7%, so almost double the total GDP figure of 3.6%. And in the paper, Milov states that the construction boom has led to the development of a major bubble in the housing market in Russia, and that by the end of 2023, the amount of unsold housing in Russia exceeded a record number of over 71 million square meters. At the same time, the Russian central bank expects significant cooling of real estate demand in Russia due to the excessive credit leveraging of households. Milov states that this situation is reminiscent of the real estate bubble currently being observed in the Chinese economy, which is taking a significant toll on China's economic prospects. Milov states that the Russian situation is, in many aspects, fairly similar. So Milov has highlighted the areas of the economy that are driving GDP growth directly as a result of the fact that Russia has switched to being a wartime economy. But he's also highlighted concerns about the traditional areas. This table shows the year-on-year movement in some of the more traditional areas of the Russian economy that have recorded lower growth than the 3.6% GDP achieved in 2023. Now, interestingly, industrial output, including military industries, only achieved 3.5% growth. And this is highly concerning because when you consider that a lot of these industries will now have converted what they're doing into providing equipment for Ukraine, the majority of that 3.5% growth will be for the wartime economy. And so in real terms, the amount that these industries are producing for their traditional markets will have fallen significantly. The year-on-year movement in agriculture was actually a fall of 0.3%. And for a country like Russia, which has a rich farming heritage and produces lots of produce, this is a major concern. Cargo turnover, which is essentially linked to imports and exports, was down by 0.6%, and this reflects the fact that Russia's trade with the rest of the world has been heavily impacted by the sanctions. And the output from mining industries, which again has been historically a strong area for Russia, was down by 1.3%. So what this data shows us is that the continued focus on the military efforts in Ukraine is damaging the traditional parts of the Russian economy. Prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Russian ruble was trading at a level of around 75 against $1. Now, immediately following the invasion, the value fell significantly. The Russian central bank then stepped in to try to support it. And over the last 2 years, President Putin has introduced a variety of initiatives to keep the value of the ruble up. And today it's trading for around 90 against $1. And that fall in value over the last 2 years has had a detrimental impact on both Russia's exports and imports. In this paper, Milov states that Western sanctions against Russia have produced two very important effects. Exports have been shrinking significantly due to Western embargoes against Russian oil and other minerals, and ceasing natural gas purchases by most of the EU member states from Gazprom. And imports have become more expensive due to increased logistical costs of trading with Asia, as well as Chinese and other Asian countries taking advantage of Russia's desperate need to substitute Western products, selling manufactured products to Russia at a premium. According to Rosstat and data based on the information from the Russian Customs Service, Russian export revenues in 2023 shrank by 28.3% year on year, while the cost of imports increased by 13.6%. According to the Russian Central Bank, Russia's current account balance in 2023 shrank by nearly 5 times from a $238 billion surplus to just $50 billion, and cargo transportation costs increased by 49.6% in December 23 compared with December 21, according to Rosstat. A shrinking currency surplus puts immense pressure on the ruble, and this puts exporters who face additional windfall taxation and other extra regulatory measures and negative consequences of sanctions under severe additional pressure. Russian business is heavily lobbying to discontinue the mandatory requirement for selling nearly all of their currency revenue since the spring of 2023. However, the Russian Finance Ministry wants it to be extended. A depreciating ruble has a major negative effect on consumer prices, and despite Putin boasting about bringing inflation below 3% in the first half of 2023, by the end of the year it had risen again to 7.5%, and inflation doesn't show any signs of receding as a result of a combination of the sharp ruble depreciation, budget deficit spending, a shortage of skilled workforce due to war, mobilisation and mass exit of skilled personnel from the country, and expensive logistics of trade with Asia and more expensive prices for imported Asian goods. As a result of high inflation, interest rates have been increased to 16%, and the report highlights that high interest rates are growth prohibitive, as no viable business returns can justify current interest rates. Russian business ombudsman Boris Titov has openly stated that with the current monetary policy, Russian economic development will curdle and freeze. As part of the paper, Milov has analysed the current National Wealth Fund to investigate exactly what's going on with regards to Russia's reserves and how much money Russia has left to continue funding the war in Ukraine. On the 1st of April 2024, the overall amount of the National Wealth Fund had contracted to 12.5 trillion rubles, which equates at the current exchange rate to around $136 billion. And this compares to the position prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where Russia was holding 13.6 trillion rubles, which, because of the exchange rate at that point, equated to around $184 billion. So over the last 2 years, there has been a net reduction in the National Wealth Fund of $48 billion. However, Milov has identified that the situation is actually much worse than that, because the liquidity portion of the National Wealth Fund, the actual amount of cash and gold held in the accounts of the Ministry of Finance in the central bank, has been disappearing at a faster rate. At the start of the war, Russia was holding 8.8 trillion rubles in cash and gold, which equated to around $113 billion. However, it's now holding just 5 trillion, which equates to $53.5 billion, which represents a reduction of around 53%. The liquidity portion of the National Wealth Fund made up around 65% of the total fund in the early part of 2022. However, it is now sitting at around 40%. And this happened because a significant part of the National Wealth Fund was invested into corporate securities of Russian state companies. These funds are still available, but not for immediate spending. At the same time as the National Wealth Fund has been reducing, the military budget of Russia has been expanding rapidly. In early 2022, the liquidity portion of the Wealth Fund was sufficient to finance the military budget at that point for 30 months. Its financing capacity today is down to less than 6 months. And this means that President Putin is running short of cash. To finance the war in Ukraine, President Putin has expanded Russia's military budget for 2024 to 10.7 trillion rubles, or around 6% of GDP, which is double the amount spent in 2023 and triple the amount of the pre-war year of 2021. Milov asked the question as to whether or not this is sustainable and states that there are no clear sources available to finance such impressive growth in spending. The federal budget for 24 includes 35 trillion rubles in federal spending, an increase of over 22% against 2023. But it's unclear where the extra money will come from as oil prices are not increasing. The planned deficit for the Russian budget is 1.6 trillion rubles for 2024, which equates to 33% of the remaining liquidity portion of the National Wealth Fund. If Russian revenue generation remains insufficient, as Milov expects, the threat of elimination of the remaining cash reserves becomes even more real in 2024. After the first 3 months of 24, the federal budget deficit had reached 0.6 trillion rubles, or around 40% of the planned annual figure. All of this clearly indicates that the Russian state budget is unsustainable, that the government is running low on financial reserves and doesn't have realistic tools of increasing revenues without impairing economic recovery, and that Putin's financial abilities to continue the war effort are under serious pressure. Another key area for the success of the Russian economy, highlighted by Milov, is the fact that Russia, now that it's lost a lot of its trading relations with the West, needs to invest into its industries to try to maintain their growth and ensure that they develop sufficiently to continue supporting the Russian economy. But Russia is facing a number of problems on this front. Firstly, it's lost its overseas investment. A lot of the Western multinationals that previously had invested heavily into Russia have exited from the country, so they're no longer seeing that influx of investment. Secondly, companies that remain in Russia are struggling in terms of the markets that they can sell into because they've lost all of those Western markets as a result of the sanctions being applied across the board against Russia. So this makes investing into those Russian businesses less attractive to overseas investors from Asia. And thirdly, there's been a huge increase in investment from the state into wartime businesses. So this isn't developing business for the long term. This is looking at the short-term benefit of providing more equipment into Ukraine. And the combination of all of these factors is really bad news for the Russian economy. This table shows the change in the level of investment into a variety of different industries in the first 9 months of 2023 compared with the same period from 2022. And what you can see is that right at the top of this chart, with an increase of almost 86%, is finished metal products other than machinery and equipment, predominantly the production of weapons and ammunition. So the key issue here is that this is directly benefiting the war in Ukraine, but isn't going into machinery and equipment, which would be for the long-term benefit of the Russian economy. So there's a short-term gain, but long-term, Russia won't see any major benefits from this. The second biggest increase in investment is in railroad transport at almost 55%, which could potentially improve the overall economic situation. However, a lot of that investment is maintaining the movement of equipment. And the third main increase in investment activity was into state administration and military security, which increased by 37%. The area that saw the fourth highest increase in investment was the mining industry. However, the investment increase was only 5.5%, followed by construction at 5%, and we discussed the issue of construction earlier, that there is now a potential bubble that's been created. A lot of money has been put into construction, but there's now a lot of unsold apartments and buildings, and so there's a potential crash coming at some point in the future. And this won't be helped by the fact that interest rates are sitting at 16% in Russia right now. The next highest level of investment was clothes production at 2.7%. And again, there is a potential link here to what's happening in Ukraine, producing uniforms for the soldiers. Pharmaceuticals production increased by 1.6%, food production by 0.9%, and the investment into agriculture actually fell by 5.4%. When you take a step back and think that the overall economy increased by 3.6%, so if we're looking at 3.6 being the average that should have been invested into all of the sectors, you can see that the bottom four here, clothes production, pharmaceuticals, food production and agriculture, which are mainstays of the Russian economy, all received investment below that level of 3.6%. And what we're seeing again here is that the focus is on the war in Ukraine and any industries that can assist with that. And the rest of the economy is not receiving the same level of investment, which is obviously bad news in the long term for Russia. This table shows the year-on-year increase in wages in selective sectors of the Russian economy in 2023. And what we can see is that the sector that received the largest increase in wages was once again finished metal products other than machinery and equipment, predominantly the production of weapons and ammunition. And if you work in that sector, you saw a growth in your wages last year of almost 24%. And what this is doing is attracting people into this sector who are leaving the more traditional sectors in Russia. So we're seeing a migration of the workforce, which is good for these businesses. Obviously, they're able to get more people on board and produce more things. But these people are being drawn into helping the war, and therefore it's helping the war economy. It's driving up GDP. But as we discussed right at the beginning of this video, is it the right movement in GDP? Is this going to benefit Russia in the long term? And the answer to that has to be no, because once this war is concluded, then this industry will not need the same level of investment and it won't be receiving the same amount of support from the Kremlin. The second biggest growth in wages was in other transport facilities and equipment, predominantly military aircraft, tanks and armoured vehicles, which saw an increase of over 22%. And the third largest increase was in computers, electronic and optical products, radar devices and radio electronics, where there was an increase in wages of 21.7%. The next largest increase was state administration and military security, again, which has a link to the war in Ukraine, where wages rose by over 15%. Agriculture saw an increase of 13.3%, construction 13.2%, wholesale and retail trade 12.8%, telecommunications 12.7%, education 12.3%, healthcare 11.4%, and mining industry saw an increase of 10.3%. And what this tells us is that the increases in the top end of this chart are actually pulling up all of the wages in Russia, because if you're an employee, you can get paid a lot more, and therefore your existing employers are probably going to need to offer you a substantial wage increase to make sure that you stay in your current job. So all of this is good news if you're an employee, because you're getting double-digit increase in your wages. But it's bad news in terms of driving up inflation. And one of the main problems that Russia has right now is high level of inflation. That's led to a 16% interest rate, which is discouraging businesses and consumers from taking on more debt and investing into the future. And so all of this is really building up serious problems for Russia, because if wages continue to increase in double digits, then that's going to continue fueling inflation, and therefore interest rates will need to be raised further, which will depress the amount of investment that companies and individuals are making into the economy, and in the long term, that will be damaging. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think it's interesting whenever there's any papers published on the current state of the Russian economy. And this one is really quite interesting because it covers a lot of the topics that we've been talking about on the channel over the past 12 to 18 months, but it brings it all together. And we also are looking at what's going on with the reserves, because I'm quite often hit with comments in the section below from people saying, what's going on with the National Wealth Fund? Is it still running out? Is it now going up? I'm seeing all these things in the paper. So at the start of today's video, we talked about the fact that GDP, although it's universally accepted as being a measure for the success of an economy, can actually be misleading. And I think that's the current position in Russia. Vladimir Milov highlighted the fact that although Russia hit 3.6% GDP growth in 2023, the vast majority of that increase was as a direct result of the fact that the Kremlin has now converted Russia into a wartime economy. So a lot of businesses have been commandeered and the Kremlin is paying them directly to produce things for Ukraine. And this is having a short-term benefit in terms of boosting that GDP growth. So 3.6% looks great compared to what the USA achieved in 2023. However, when you take a step back and think about the long-term prospects, they're not particularly good, because as soon as that war in Ukraine ends, then the Kremlin will stop sponsoring all of those businesses, and they will then have to fend for themselves. And if a lot of these companies have become dependent on that war income, then they're going to struggle to be able to regain their old customer bases, deliver revenue, deliver taxes, and therefore keep GDP in Russia going. So this is, I think, one of the really key takeaways from this paper, that GDP percentages can be very misleading. It's far too easy to just compare percentages and say, well, that country is obviously doing better than the other country because its percentage is higher. You need to lift the bonnet, look at the details, and find out exactly what's driving that GDP growth. And that's what was highlighted in this paper, that Russia is boosting its own GDP by diverting a lot of its income into all of these industries. But long term, that won't help Russia's growth prospects. And it was interesting in the paper, I think, that it was highlighted that the Soviet Union actually posted year-on-year GDP growth in every year up until 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart. And that's when Russia went into a deep recession. So those figures can definitely be misleading. You can paper over the cracks by doing things to get that percentage up. Now, I think the other major takeaway from the paper is what's going on with the National Wealth Fund. And over the past 2 years, there has been a significant reduction in the total value of the wealth fund, from around $184 billion to around $136 today, which represents a fall of around 26%. However, once again, you need to look into the details as to what we're talking about when we're talking about National Wealth Fund. And the key area is the liquidity of that fund, things that can be converted quickly into cash that can be used to fund the economy. And the two things that Russia has are gold and its currency reserves. And a lot of its currency reserves today are in Chinese yuan. And the key issue that was highlighted in this report is that over the last 2 years, the level of liquid reserves has fallen by more than 50%. And in the analysis that Milov provided, he was saying that at the start of the war, the amount of liquid reserves that Russia was sitting on was financing around 30 months worth of war, because at that point, the war budget was much smaller. However, today, the liquid reserves are only enough to finance around 5.5 months, as a result of the fact that the liquid reserves have gone down and the war budget has gone up. And Milov is questioning whether or not Russia has enough cash to keep this war going, unless it can start growing its income significantly, finding a way of monetizing its oil and gas better than it is today. There will come a point when those liquid reserves will run out. And if Russia gets to that situation, then it won't be able to keep financing the war. And when you think about that issue of financing the war, it's not just paying for all of the tanks and military equipment in Ukraine. It's also funding all of these businesses that have now been commandeered to help the war effort. So Russia is spending money on a number of different fronts rapidly to keep that war going. And Milov's assessment is that at some point, Russia could run out of cash. And I think that's the main takeaway from today. So the overall summary of today's video is that Vladimir Milov believes that the GDP figures that Russia has been posting are misleading, that GDP is being boosted by the war effort and the Kremlin sponsoring a lot of businesses. This is artificially inflating the growth figures, but is detrimental to the long-term growth of the Russian economy. Russia is now running short of reserves, and unless it can start realizing a lot more capital, those reserves will run out, and at some point, Russia will not be able to keep funding the war in Ukraine. So hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.